Greetings, Remnant Church and online friends. Welcome to this week's Midweek Refuel, where we explore the ancient light in order to illuminate today's darkness. This week, we will be taking a look at Book 9, chapters 11 through 12 of Augustine's Confessions, and we are still discussing Augustine's mother's death. But this week, we're doing it from a slightly different angle than we have in previous weeks. If you will recall, Augustine's mother died while traveling or while she was abroad. Augustine has already told us about his mother. He's told us quite a bit about his mother, and she seems to have been not just an incredible woman, but also a incredible spiritual adept. He has told us how she impacted his spiritual life and his spiritual journey. He shares with us his mother's words as she approaches the grave itself. And in today's reading, she indeed passes into eternity. But that is not really the focus of what we're being told. The focus is on Augustine's reaction to her death and how his inner workings fare as he traverses the valley of bereavement. These short chapters remind me, in a lesser way, of course, of C.S. Lewis's phenomenal work, A Grief Observed. If you haven't read A Grief Observed, then you owe it to yourself to do so. It will prepare you in advance for the pains and the trials that you may not have experienced yet. I read it when I was very young. If you read it and you hear that I read that when I was 9, it's going to seem like a bit much. But I did. I read it when I was very young, long before much of it made really any sense to me. But it prepared me for the hurt of life in advance. And I've read it many times since then. And each time I read it, it helps me. Many parts of Lewis's candid and bald confession of the deepest grief and pains have helped me through some of the toughest times in my life when I'm going through grief and pain. I've seen somebody do it, and it helps me to navigate those low points. There is something helpful about knowing that your pain and your anger are a common trait among mankind and nothing to be ashamed of or feel weird about, and absolutely nothing to hide. I've had people in my life pass away. We all have, but no one who was terribly close to me has passed away. That's going to sound strange to people who know me because I had a grandmother that passed away, and she passed away a few years back, and she requested that I actually officiate the funeral, which was very tough on me. Hard to give a funeral for somebody you love. But I was raised several hours away from her my entire life. I was raised about 15 hours away during my earliest childhood years and about 4 hours away the rest of my life. It was a joy to know her. I wish she was here now. She showed me love, kindness, compassion, and a stern hand in rules and law. It was a joy to know her. My life is better because I met her, and I loved her dearly. My mother and father my mother and father directed me towards becoming a Christian. Grandma directed me towards being a mystic, a Christian mystic. But the loss did not impact my normal circumstances of life enough to lay me flat or devastate me in the same way that I saw others devastated, sons and daughters. My parents and my church family both taught me at a young age the importance of loving others. My grandmother is the lady who taught me that love is power. This may sound silly, but it affected me greatly, and I have benefited from what she taught me. She taught me that love can be used as a force. It can be used as a healing source, as a reconciling force. It's a force unlike any other, more powerful than anything, and yet weaker than everything. Weakness is power in the realm of love. Weakness becomes strength, and the last becomes the first. One day, long ago, she was putting some, what I called the magic brown paste, but magic brown balm on one of my cousins who had hurt themselves. And I forget how they had hurt themselves, but I know they were in a great deal of pain. I had seen the nasty brown jar of grease ever since I can remember. Every memory I have of visiting her below the age of 12, there was this brown jar of grease in the bathroom that they called medicine. But I didn't know what was in it. I just knew that it worked. This particular time, I had finally come of age enough to be curious about my surroundings and the content of the nasty brown grease jar. She said, "Oh, Johnny, the brown stuff doesn't do anything. It's the love that heals them." And so now, under her confidence, I watched as she rubbed this concoction all over my cousin. And lo and behold, guess what? She started to get better. I watched in wonder as the entire spirit of the room filled with light and health. And you might be thinking to yourself that I'm being impressed by something very little. If you believe that, then please go out and research the power of prayer and the power of loving words and the power of what the Bible, I would believe, would call think on these things, and the power of doing good deeds. Even plants grow healthier and more beautiful if they are loved. There's research that shows if you talk lovingly to them, they do better. 1 John tells us this, quote, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love," unquote, centuries before Frank Herbert. Shoot. Even Christopher Nolan, my favorite director, even Christopher Nolan's Interstellar acknowledges that love is a force, or acknowledges love as a force that transcends both space and time. If I may be so crass or so bold, I don't know which, but if I may, love is the initiatory key into the mysteries of Jesus Christ himself. I give you a mystery. Paul writes this, "The mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people. To them, God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory," unquote. At my grandmother's funeral, you could actually see the striations in pain, or the differences in pain, as it lessened out from sons and daughters being the most moved on to grandchildren who were somewhat moved, and then on to the youngest who attended the funeral because they were dragged along and didn't know what was happening, were more moved by the tears around them and the confusion around them than by the death of my grandmother herself. And that's totally understandable. Those who have lost a spouse or lost a parent with whom they currently lived seem to suffer deeper and more egregious wounds than neighbors and friends in the same situation, or at least in my experience, that's what I have observed. I accept that there might be outliers who stand outside of the stereotype that I've painted, but it is true for most people, I believe. The world has sociopaths and the world has hyper-emotive types, but for most of us, what I've said holds true. I truly believe that the grief we feel about the passing of a loved one is directly related to the hole that that person leaves in our lives and in our daily routine. The more a part of our daily routine they are, if they were a positive part of that routine, the more we suffer from their absence. All of us know or have heard of the husband or wife who dies shortly after their wife or husband passed away. This particular phenomenon is known as broken heart syndrome, or the widowhood effect. I assume it is because the hole that is left in that person's life is far too large for their heart to survive. And that is truly romantic, isn't it? It is truly romantic. It is truly lovely in an admittedly morbid way. You must walk through the door with the skull and the crossbones if you are to encounter the mystery. Augustine feels out of place, and he is questioning his right to even cry from a Christian perspective. If they are not really dead, if they have just gone on and left their tent here on earth, then is it spiritually right to cry? I must admit that Augustine is sometimes a little OCD with his spirituality. Sometimes he's a little overboard, in my opinion. Maybe he's right. He worries about every single spiritual detail. He worries about everything spiritual. Is this okay? I struggle with this question. Is this okay? Is that okay? Can I cry at a funeral? It's all a bit much if you put everything under the microscope, or at least I would like to think it is. I hate to say it, but Augustine's spirituality sometimes puts me off a little. I love reading him. I love learning from him. But to be honest, I think that many times he's just a spiritual worrywart. It kind of bothers me a little. What if he's right? What if he's right and I'm wrong? He makes the yoke sound heavy, but perhaps Jesus' yoke is light. Jesus said, "Come and have rest." But Augustine seems bound and determined to analyze every thought, action, and emotion through the lens of doctrine and theology. And I think that's okay, but he sounds like he is very worried about it. My Lord says, don't worry. I would really like to leave analyzing that behind and instead just find peace in Jesus Christ, who has wrote the law in my heart so that I might live it. A peace that actually writes the truth on my inner being and allows me to, at one time, rebuke my brother, get behind me, Satan, and at another time, pour alabaster perfume out as a love offering and be extravagant. I will not worry that my brother will impede me, nor do I feel guilty about the great time we had with the alabaster perfume at our relative's house. The part that I'm talking about, the part that makes me think Augustine is getting OCD about it, is the part where he begins to imply and bemoan the fact that he wants and needs to cry. And I say, brother, cry. To be fair, he isn't the first person that I have encountered who's asked this question or has troubled themselves with this reality. I've had several people over the years come and ask me something along the lines of this. If I know they are in heaven, if I know they are eternal and with Christ, and I know they are saved, and I know I will see them again, is it a sin to be angry, sad, or even despondent over their death? If you've ever wondered that, then please let me relieve your spiritual sensitivities. You may cry. You are not crying that they are gone forever. You are crying about someone who's gone on a very, very far trip ahead of you, and you will not see them again for a very long time until you make that same trip. And at some undisclosed time, they have left a hole in your life and a hole in your heart, even if they have not left a hole in the universe. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It doesn't say mourning is bad or wrong. It says simply that you will be comforted, and the mourning will end sometime. Reading Lewis's A Grief Observed is at times extremely painful and uncomfortable because of the sheer candor with which Lewis addresses God. He addresses him in a bold way that at first seems, it makes you timid as you hear it. It makes you cower a little, but then you go and turn to the Psalms and realize this is how people have talked with God. And it seems like the ones that are closest with him talk to him like this the most often. If I recall correctly, at one point, C.S. Lewis points his finger at God and calls him a sadistic child who sits over the rest of us with a magnifying glass to burn us like ants. And yet, at the end of that book, comfort has come. And Lewis is closer to God then than before anything else, than before simply because he simply got real with God. God already knows what you're thinking. Thinking you're hiding it separates you from God, not God from you. Adam, where are you? Exodus tells us this, quote, "The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." Job 7:11 says this, quote, "Therefore I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul," unquote. Long lesson short, I have learned in my own life to speak to God as a friend, as a family member. And that simple act, that simple exercise, while still, even in the worst of times, is drenched in a reverence of God, of course, that simple act has helped me to understand and feel what it means to be a friend of Christ and to be a confidant of God. I can remember at least three times, standing out in the parking lot of the church I was preaching at after some catastrophe or people going to war and saying to myself, and perhaps and paraphrasing Moses, "My people? I don't think so. These are your people." Grieving over his grief. I repeat that. Grieving over his grief, Augustine writes, quote, "But I knew what I was suppressing in my heart, and being sorely displeased at myself to find that these human traits, while according to the due order and lot of our condition must needs befall us, had such power over me, I grieved with fresh grief for my grief, and was torn by a twofold sadness," unquote. Jesus says he will give you life, and that more abundantly. Please let me remind you, life includes a lot of stuff. Life includes mourning, sadness, but life also includes joy and happiness. Embrace it all in the name of Jesus Christ, and know that he laughs with you and he cries with you. And if asked, he will always comfort you. Another interesting quote from today's reading goes like this, quote, "My soul, therefore, being bereft of the great solace that she had given me, his mother, was smitten and, so to speak, stripped of its life, the life that had been made one out of her life and mine," unquote. Augustine has lost something incredible, something dear, something precious, not just a mother, but also the living thing that existed when he and his mother communed with each other. I can't really nail down why. I wish I could. There's a part of me that understands, but it's not the verbal part. I can't really nail down why that is. But that quote that we just read makes me recall these particular words of my Savior from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus says, quote, "For where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I with them," unquote. I don't know which order to tackle the concepts to which I wish to introduce you today. Whenever two people come together, something triangular happens, something living comes into being from this union. And it is the dynamic, the encounter, the collision of sentient beings that causes another life force to vibrate and change the relational vibrancy of that situation. If Jesus is where two or more are gathered in his name, then Trinity itself is built into the very fabric of every relationship that we have if we will allow it to have its way. That is important, for you cannot love God and hate your neighbor. Hating is mutually exclusive to Trinity living. Personalities, they're like hand grenades. When they go off, everyone within range absorbs the shrapnel and finds that their personalities, their own personalities, are changed by the shards of other personalities. Haven't you ever noticed that you change slightly with different people? Your humor changes, your negativity changes, your positivity changes, the way you speak even changes. That is why you are different around different people. Not in a bad way, not in a hypocritical way, but in a very natural way that brings to life that which once did not exist. There are many verses, many verses about friendship in our Holy Bible. But I found this particular proverb to be apt at this present moment. Proverbs says, quote, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm," unquote. I would love to talk about the ways in which these chapters made me think about logos and telos, but that'll have to wait. Turn, if you will, to Book 9, chapters 11 through 12. And if you need a copy, you can find this work and many other wonderful classics for free on the Gutenberg Project website. And I'll leave a link below for that. Also, before we get to reading, if you would take a moment and just reach up and hit the like and subscribe button, it helps us get into more homes, and we do appreciate it. Starting in Book 9, chapter 11. What I said in reply, I cannot recall. Let's go back a second. If you'll remember the last Augustine lesson we did, his mother asked, "What am I doing here?" Starting chapter 11 again. What I said in reply, I cannot recall. For within a mere 5 days, or not much more, she took to her bed with an attack of fever. One day, as she lay sick, she fell unconscious, and for a short time she was taken away from those present. We all ran into the room, but she was quickly restored to her senses, and catching sight of my brother and me as we stood by her, she said, as if puzzled, "Where was I?" Then, perceiving our grief and consternation, she said, "You will leave your mother to rest here." I said nothing and checked my tears. My brother, however, said something or other, encouraging her to believe that she would die in her homeland and not abroad, as if that were a happier way to die. On hearing this, her face was filled with anxiety. Pushing him aside with her eyes for thinking in this way, then gazing at me, she said, "See what he says." Then to both of us she said, "Leave my body where you will. Do not be troubled with any concern on its behalf. One thing only I ask you, that you remember me at the altar of the Lord wherever you are." Having framed this sentence in such words as she could, she fell silent, tossed about by the worsening sickness. I, however, rejoiced as I meditated on your gifts, O God, invisible, the gifts that you put into the hearts of your believers, from which spring such admirable fruits. And I gave thanks to you as I recalled what I knew well, how she had always been in a fever of anxiety about her burial place, which she had appointed and prepared for herself against the time alongside the body of her husband. For having lived in great harmony with him, she wished, so little can the human mind comprehend of things divine, to add to that happiness. She wished it to be remembered among men that after her travels across the seas, it had been granted to her that her dust should be mixed with her husband's and his with his wife's. When this empty wish had, by the fullness of your bounty, begun to retreat from her heart, I did not know, and I was full of wonder and rejoicing that she had shown herself thus to me, even though in our conversation at the window, when she had said, "What am I doing here?" she had not shown any longing to die in her homeland. I heard too later that while we were at Ostia, she talked one day with certain friends of mine, with the assurance permitted to a mother, on the contempt of this life and benefits of dying. I was not there, but they were astounded at this woman's courage, which you had given her, and had asked whether she was not afraid to leave her body so far from her own city. "Nothing," she replied, "is far from God, nor need I fear that at the end of the world he will not know where to raise me up." On the 9th day, then, of her illness, in the 56th year of her life, and the 33rd year of mine, that pious and devout soul was released from her body. I pressed her eyes shut, And as I did so, a great flood of grief flowed into my heart and overflowed in tears. Immediately, my eyes, at a forced command of the will, absorbed this fountain and dried up completely. And it was ill with me in that great struggle. Then, too, as she breathed her last, the child Adeodatus burst out in lamentation. Then, restrained by all the rest of us, fell silent. In this way, something childish in me also, the something that was slipping into tears, was checked by the voice of that young heart and fell silent. For we did not think it proper that her death should be marked with tearful plaints and groans, these being the usual means of bewailing, as it were, the unhappy lot of the dead, their complete snuffing out. But there was nothing unhappy in my mother's death, nor was she dying utterly. This we held to be true by the testimony of her moral character, her unfeigned faith, and by irrefutable reasoning. What was it then that ached so deeply within me, if not the fresh wound that came from the sudden breaking of the habit of living together in all sweetness and love? I rejoiced, it is true, in her testimony, how in her last illness itself, by way of compliment to some service of mine, she would call me a dutiful son, and in the greatness of her love recall that she had never heard my lips cast a hard word or insulting sound at her. But what was the honor I did to her compared to the devoted service that she had rendered me? My soul, therefore, being bereft of the great solace that she had given me, was smitten and, so to speak, stripped of its life, the life that had been made one out of her life and mine. So it was that when we had checked young Adeodatus's tears, Evodius seized a psaltery and began to sing a psalm. The whole household answered him with the response, "Mercy and judgment shall I sing to you, O Lord." Many of the brothers and many female religious, hearing what was happening, came and joined us. Those whose duty it was to arrange the funeral did so in the customary way, and I went aside to a place where I could with propriety speak, and before those who accompanied me, thinking that I should not be left alone, I gave a disputation on a theme suitable to the occasion. Thus, with the lotion of truth, I soothed my agony, an agony known to you, but unknown to them. They listened intently and thought that I had no sense of grief, but I rebuked my affection in your ears where none of them could hear for its lack of toughness, and checked the flood of sorrow, and gradually it receded from me only to return, driven by its own momentum. It did not succeed in breaking out in tears or in changing my countenance, but I knew what I was suppressing in my heart, and being solely displeased at myself to find that these human traits, which according to the due order and lot of our condition must needs befall us, had such power over me, I grieved with fresh grief for my grief, and was torn by a twofold sadness. Even when the body was taken out for burial, I went and came back without weeping. Not even in the course of the prayers that we poured out to you, when according to the custom of the place, the sacrifice of our ransom price was offered for my mother as her body lay beside the sepulchre. Before being laid to rest in it, not even in the course of those prayers did I weep, but all day long I besought you as best I could to heal my grief. But you did not heal me, perhaps wishing to impress on my memory how the chain of every habit is opposed to a mind which feeds on the word in whom there is deceit. I even thought I should take a bath, as I had heard that the baths were so called for this very reason. The Greeks called them balanion, because they drive care from the mind. This too I confess to your mercifulness, O Father of the orphans. I took a bath, and after my bath was just as I had been before. The bitterness of grief had not been sweated out of my heart. Then I slept, and woke again, and found my grief gently lessened. And as I lay alone in my bed, I recalled those true spoken verses of your servant Ambrose, O thou, the all-creator God, God of the heavens on their road, who dost the day with glorious light adorn, with grateful sleep the night, sleep that the limbs from toil once more refreshed to labor might restore, to weary minds might give relief, and set the mourner free from grief. From then on, I regained little by little my former perception of your handmaid and her mode of living, her piety towards you, her holy gentleness towards me, her moral rectitude. I was destitute of her, and it was a pleasure to weep in your sight over her and for her, over myself and for myself. The tears that I had held back, I gave leave to flow as much as they wanted, spreading them out where my heart could see them, and I found rest in them. For in them were your ears, not the ears of some man who might look on my weeping with contempt. Even now, O Lord, I confess to you in these writings, let him who will read them and look on them how he will. And if he should find some sin in my weeping for my mother for the least part of an hour, the mother who was for a while dead in my eyes, who had wept for me for so many years that I might live in your eyes, let him not laugh at me, but rather, if he is full grown in love, let him also weep for my sins to you, the Father of all brothers of your Christ. Before we go on, let me give you some advice for presenting your condolences to those in your life who may be grieving. Tell them that you are sorry for their loss. Hug them if it's appropriate, and then sit down quietly, with tears if you have them, and just be present. The third part of the triangle will take care of everything else. They don't need you to make them feel better. You couldn't anyway. They don't need you to resurrect the dead. Someone else has that under control. They don't need you to distract them from their grief, for they are blessed and just waiting to be comforted. Instead, be with them and know that because you are there, there is a third life that is present with you. And it is this third life that brings the comfort of Trinity. Let him not laugh at me, but rather, if he is full grown in love, let him also weep for my sins to you, the Father of all brothers, and your Christ. Christ is King. Hail to the King.